Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Ms. Tish Long, Chairwoman of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance Board of Directors, and Lieutenant General Susan Lawrence, United States Army, retired, President and CEO of AFCEA International.
Well, good morning. How are you? How was your evening? I had a hard time getting through the reception, so everybody thank you for staying and enjoying that and continuing the network. So welcome to day 2 of our Intelligence and National Security Summit. We have enjoyed yesterday's program, I know you all did, and the networking sessions last night. I mean, how can you top? We kicked the day off with our deputy directors of our intelligence agencies, had 2 amazing breakout sessions with great feedback. Thank you for participating. Chairman Long's discussion with our senators really brought home where the Hill is thinking, how it's impacting us in our community. Great job there. And then closed with our service intel leads, who did a great job. And I'm going to vote with Senator Warner. Who would ever vote against the United States of America with leaders we saw yesterday on the stage? It was awesome. So this year has been no exception to the strategic insights as we move forward and on our national security challenge of a rising China. So as a reminder, we value your questions. The address is on the screen. Make sure that you submit them early so that we can review them. Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you, Susan. And let me add my warm welcome to everyone this morning. I thought yesterday was terrific as well. In addition to the sessions that Susan outlined, which, well attended, great feedback, the breakout sessions were standing room only, and I suspect today is going to be the same way. So please, as Susan said, we value your questions, your participation, and again, the booths are all still out there today, so interaction with our industry partners is much appreciated. Later today, you will receive an event survey at your registration email address. Please be candid in your assessment. I know there are no shrinking violets out there. We really do value your feedback. That's what makes this event better and better each year. And I think we must be getting better because we have the largest attendance we've ever had. So well done to everyone in making this happen. And most of all, our sponsors. A big thank you to our sponsors. And again, just encourage you to interact with the exhibitors today. Now, I believe we have our first session ready to go. So it is my pleasure to introduce Gwen Clavon, Senior Vice President and General Manager, Cyber and Intelligence Solutions from Jacobs, to introduce our plenary session. Please give a warm welcome for Gwen. Oh, after that, please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that warm introduction, and hopefully you experienced the video and you realize how all of the great stuff that Jacobs does. I am so grateful for joining you today, and I'm so happy to see the attendance levels at where they are. The Intelligence and National Security Summit is the premier forum for the IC to come together with their public, private, and academic partners to discuss common challenges, gain insights and lessons learned from colleagues, and looking ahead to the future. We all play a role in building a stronger and more resilient community in. Jacobs has been a trusted government partner and longstanding supporter of FCA and NSF for many years. Jacobs sees a huge value in investing in the next generation of investors, engineers, developers, et cetera, by offering scholarships and internship programs. Each year, we challenge our interns to tackle some difficult problems and approach things in a way that may not always be conventional. Some ideas are successful, some not so much. But encouraging and providing a platform for the next generation of talent is something that Jacobs values for its future success as well as the success for this community. With programs like this where we encourage new ideas and to think outside the box, we can address the problems of today's and those on the horizon. There are complex problems facing our nation, and so working together to deliver leading-edge solutions much faster will advance our shared national security mission. It is a tremendous privilege to be associated with so many talented and dedicated professionals. Among them is the moderator of today's session, who I have the honor of introducing. This is a man who has over 36 years of active duty service. He was the senior advisor to the Secretary of the Army and Army Chief of Staff, and was the 21st director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He has a bachelor's and 2 master's degrees in strategic intelligence and strategic studies, and is the CEO of Ashley Global Leadership and Security. Please give a warm welcome for Lieutenant General Bob Ashley.
Let me make sure I'm good. We were going to run the video of me arriving in an Uber, but it was less impressive than what you saw from Jacobs. So for our panel, thanks for being here. Thanks for agreeing to do this. And we invited a couple of our friends to be able to listen to the conversation this morning. I'm going to give you a brief outline, and then I'll make the introductions. You saw in the program it was China the long game, which is really what China does from a strategy standpoint. So we want to talk a little bit about national interest, their strategy, and their end state. To frame the panel, the approach we're taking is national instruments of power. So we're going to look at this from a dime perspective. We're not lined up in the dime, but we're going to look at diplomatic, information, military, economic from our speakers, and then we're going to kind of broaden the scope and let anybody delve into whatever lane they want. The other key part about this is understanding there's a say-do disconnect. There's what China says, and there's what they actually do. And we want to make sure we have an opportunity to talk a little bit about that. And the other is the context of the discussion. You know, we can talk about Xi, we can talk about China as a nation, or the PLA military, but really it's about the Chinese Communist Party, which is really driving the direction that they're headed. A lot has been written in the last decade about Xi, about the old Deng Xiaoping strategy of hiding your strength and biding your time, that they've moved beyond that. And a lot about, you know, how well do we really understand the Chinese Communist Party? Do we understand China as a nation? Do we understand their people? You know, I thank Tom for a book that he shared with me a couple of years ago called The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, which was China from 1776 to present, about, you know, how we've failed to really understand the culture, the people over actually a couple of centuries, let alone the last couple of decades as we're trying to sharpen our understanding. If you go back to 2015, 2016, you heard a lot of discussions about the Thucydides trap, right? You have a rising and a reigning power, in this case, the reigning power being the US, the rising power being China. And in those discussions, inherently, a lot of those situations, and in this case, the Peloponnesian War, ended in conflict. And there was a book called Destined for War that was written by Graham Allison back in 2016, where the title is Destined for War, Can China and America Avoid the Thucydides Trap? And in the book, Dr. Allison lays out 16 use cases, 12 of which ends in conflict. And it makes me think about a quote from General Mattis, then Secretary Mattis, where he said, "A generation from now, we will be judged on whether we successfully integrated rising powers while increasing economic prosperity, maintaining international cooperation based on an agreed upon rules and norms, protecting fundamental rights of our people and avoiding conflict." That is the quintessential challenge that we face today, unpacked in General Mattis's comment. Also looked at a recent article that talked about, if you're familiar with the game Go, trying to explain the complexity of what we have before us. And if you're familiar with the game Go, it's you're putting these stones out and you're controlling territory. So there's no penultimate move where you capture the king. You just gain points in the territory you control. But it was a comparison of a game of Go where the boundaries are changing in a Rubik's Cube. And that we have this dime construct, but at the same time, you can't just solve for the orange panel, you can't solve for the green panel, you have to solve them simultaneously. And even though we're talking the dime, I realize a cube has 6 sides and a dime is 4. Bear with me on the analogy. So what does this mean in the current international order? And I'm not going to call it the liberal order, I'm not going to call it the rules-based, I'm just going to say, we're going to talk about the international order that's been in place since the end of World War II. And then the other part of that, and I'll close out and introduce the panel, is context. Context at the National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, and the annual threat statement from the DNI. So the National Security Strategy. China has both the intent to reshape the international order and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and the technological power to do it. National Defense Strategy. This is our most consequential strategic competitor and the pacing challenge for the department. The annual threat statement from the DNI. Chinese Communist Party will continue efforts to achieve President Xi's vision of making China the preeminent power in East Asia and a major power on the world stage. And a lot of questions have been asked is, do they want to replace the U.S. on the world stage, not just be a preeminent power? British Prime Minister Pomeroy back in the 1870s once said that nations do not have enduring allies and partners. They only have enduring interests, and we want to talk a little bit about some of China's interests. So what I'm asking our panelists to do is spend about 5 to 7 minutes with some opening comments. We're going to go across the dime, and then we're going to come back to some set questions for them, and then I'll log onto this iPad and take questions from you as well. So our panel in dime order. Gary Tripmacher on the far end is a Global Unit Chief from the Office of China Coordination in the U.S. Department of State. He's a special advisor for Europe and Russia under Vice Presidents Harris and Pence. From 2017 to 19, he served as the Deputy Director of the U.S. Mission to the United Nations Washington office, advising nations Ambassador Nikki Haley on China. And Gary has a BA in History from Boston College and a Master's in International Affairs from George Washington. Nathan Beauchamp Mustafaga is a researcher at the RAND Corporation focusing on Asian security affairs. His research interests include Chinese foreign policy, strategy, emerging technology, and influence operations. Recently published a report on how Chinese military is thinking about next generation psychological warfare. And Nathan spent 3 years in China where he's completed degrees, where he went to a high school in China, a university, and lived in 5 different cities and attended 7 different schools. To my left, on the M, we're thankful that at the last minute, the good Admiral Aquilino didn't reach out and say, Tom, you can't travel. We have the Indo-PACOM J2. While at Johns Hopkins University and School of Advanced International Studies, Tom was the Navy's Samuel Eliot Morrison Scholar, where he examined U.S. PRC mill-to-mill relationships in the context of the China political system. He served as a Navy liaison. He has 9 years in China. Let me say that again. Tom has 9 years in China. He was the assistant naval attaché, the naval attaché, and he was our defense attaché. from 2016 to 2012. And finally, rounding us out on the E, Dr. Bonnie Lin, who's the Director of China Power Project and the Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She was the Acting Associate Director for Strategy and Doctrine Programs of Political Science at RAND Corporation, where she analyzed different aspects of China's foreign and defense policy and competition with the U.S., including China's use of gray zone tactics and strategy. She also served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense from 2015 to 2018. She was the Director for Taiwan, Country Director for China, and a Senior Advisor on China. And this is my favorite part. Dr. Lin holds a PhD from Yale, a degree from Michigan, and a degree from Harvard. So I'm humbled by my fine Appalachian State University degree to have Bonnie on the panel. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gary to kick us off on the D.
Thank you very much, General. And thank you to our hosts at the Intelligence National Security Summit for convening us today, and for all of you for joining us. I want to return to something that the General said at the top from National Security Strategy, and it's something that our Secretary has said as well, which is that the PRC is the only country with the intent and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological capability to do it, to reshape the international system. And this ambition is a driving force behind the PRC's foreign policy and diplomacy. After decades of limiting its engagement with the international system, the PRC is attempting to reshape it in order to better safeguard its interests as it defines them. And this is an absolutely stated ambition of the PRC government. Just earlier this week, President Xi hosted the Speaker of the Russian Federation Council and said that Russia and China together should lead the correct direction of global governance reform. And you'll recall in March when President Xi visited President Putin in Moscow, he left by saying, right now there are changes unseen in 100 years, and we are leading those changes together. Beijing has painted an alternate picture of the international order. Its Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and Global Civilization Initiative illustrate the ambitions that the PRC has in order to realize a new international order. It's created new alternate international institutions in the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and it's created new networks in the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is a marked contrast from the PRC's previous wary engagement diplomatically and internationally. To use just one example, in China's first 4 decades at the UN Security Council, it vetoed 6 resolutions. Since 2011, they've vetoed 12 resolutions, so almost twice as many as they did in the first 4 decades on the Council, which shows the nature of their increasing engagement and increasing assertiveness. What's somewhat ironic about this is that arguably no country on earth has benefited more from the post-World War II international order than the PRC. The conditions that fueled the PRC's transformation, free trade, secure sea lanes, absence of great power conflicts, were enabled by U.S. power and by the Bretton Woods institutions that the post-World War II international order represents. These provided the stability and the opportunity that were necessary for the PRC's transformation. Yet Beijing views these institutions warily and seeks to reshape them. The vision that the PRC has, the alternate vision, is troubling. And the reason why it's troubling is this. As our Secretary has said, Beijing's vision would move us away from the universal values that have stained so much of the world's progress over the past 75 years. The models presented, the alternate model presented by the GDI, the GSI, the GCI, they're seemingly benign on their surface, but when you examine them more closely, you see a troubling alternative. All of them de-emphasize individual rights and political rights. They enhance the role of the state, and they privilege the rights of larger states over smaller states, eroding their sovereignty. When you see the PRC in international organizations, it focuses on the rights of states instead of the rights of individuals. It focuses on economic development, but not political rights and individual rights. If you look at the Global Security Initiative more closely, you'll see that it addresses bilateral dispute mechanisms instead of the right to collective security that's guaranteed by the UN Charter. Why that's problematic is because in bilateral disputes, necessarily the larger power has a greater say than under a rules-based system that the UN provides, and a collective system that allows countries to band together at their own sovereign will. The PRC is attempting to build a coalition in order to realize its desire to reshape the international system. It assiduously courts developing countries, and it also seeks to divide the United States from its traditional allies and partners. You'll see that Beijing has had some diplomatic successes. For instance, the Chinese foreign minister's first trip is always to Africa, which is not coincidentally the largest block of votes in the UN system. But they've also been their own worst enemies in many ways, and their increasingly assertiveness has laid bare some of the problems that are associated with the alternate vision that Beijing has for the international order. We see this most notoriously with their wolf warrior diplomacy, very aggressive statements and interventions, their economic coercion, which I'm sure we'll talk about in greater detail, and then the long-term challenges of even its successes like the Belt and Road Initiative are becoming increasingly clear as countries become increasingly indebted. And so whether the PRC succeeds long-term is going to depend on part on whether the United States makes the case to allies and partners and to countries around the world that defending the international system as it is and reforming it when necessary is to the benefit of all nations. You'll hear our administration's strategy is invest, align, compete toward the PRC. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of the align portion. As the Secretary said, this isn't about forcing countries to choose, but it's about giving them a choice. And I'll close with a quote from Secretary Blinken, which is that we want to strengthen a system in which as many countries as possible can come together to cooperate effectively, resolve differences peacefully, and write their own futures as sovereign equals. That is what the current international system provides, and that's what we want to preserve. Thank you.
Gary, thanks. Nathan?
Great. Thank you for having me today. I'm going to make 3 main points about how China approaches the information environment and information-related activities, and then close by making an additional point on perhaps what the United States gets wrong or should reconsider in this competition. So the first point, the main point, is that China, and the CCP specifically, really does appreciate the importance of shaping the information environment and winning hearts and minds. In a sense, they do this to stay in power every day. Xi Jinping has spoken about this since he came to power. He's really made this a priority within the system. However, as Gary was just mentioning, for those of us who are on Twitter and watch, if not follow, Chinese diplomats' accounts on Twitter, we know that they're not always good or deft at this, right? And so sometimes they can be their own worst enemy in a sense. The second point is to say that China really does use all the tools at its disposal to succeed and achieve their vision for the information space. So they do information censorship, blocking. They do really trying to control the information space. They also do kind of positive propaganda for their own narrative lines. And then they also increasingly now do information manipulation, disinformation, and misinformation as well. They do this overtly through their own, publicly acknowledged state media, and they do this covertly through, nominally unaffiliated accounts on social media and other kind of covert means as well. They really work to incorporate this across the dime and make this, a core part of their diplomatic efforts, their economic efforts, as well as their military efforts. There is indeed some variation between the narratives and their approach domestically and for foreign audiences around the globe. And then lastly is to say that they are indeed doing more internationally, just like many of my fellow panelists are going to speak about greater Chinese engagement across the dime. But I'll note that this is not just because they are pursuing more of their own increasingly global interests. I think from a CCP perspective, from Xi Jinping's perspective, is also because they view more threats from the global information space to the CCP's ability to remain in power. And so they're trying to more actively combat those threats. And then third point would be that the Chinese military, as many of us are interested in this room, is evolving its approach to the information space, its I/O strategy, just as one case study of many actors within the CCP party-state system. Many of us are going to be familiar with the 3 warfares concept, which is the operational concept that PLA developed in the mid-2000s to approach psychological warfare, public opinion warfare, and legal warfare. However, I would argue that over the last 5+ years, the PLA is increasingly enamored with a new operational concept that subsumes the three warfares called cognitive domain operations, which fundamentally is a reflection of the PLA's increasing recognition that there's a new domain of warfare, the cognitive domain. And so then the question is, if there is a new domain of warfare, how do you adjust your operational concepts to seize an advantage in that domain? And that domain and this cognitive domain operation concept really focuses on leveraging emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and also brain science for more tailored, better targeted information influence operations. So then lastly, what does the United States perhaps get wrong or should reconsider in its approach? First, I think perhaps different than some of the other parts of the dime that other panelists are going to address, in my view, if you really ask Xi Jinping, he probably thinks the United States is actually still winning in the information space. There are structural advantages for the United States, not just the US government, but broader US society and Western society in terms of how successful narratives are across the globe. So I think that should give the United States more confidence in how we approach this part of the competition. Indeed, while China is in the UN and elsewhere arguing about how we should define human rights and how we should define democracy, I would argue that that still fundamentally reflects an acknowledgement of the US advantage here, that they are agreeing on the importance of democracy and human rights. The alternative is that they could just abandon it and say, yes, we're an authoritarian system with a dictator. We think that's great. He's more efficient, he's more effective, we don't have these messy elections, we just get it done. But when President Biden recently called Xi Jinping straight up a dictator, the response was not to embrace that and say, yes, we're pretty proud, we think it's a good thing. Right? The response was to argue on the merits of the case, which I think fundamentally reflects a US and broader status quo international order advantage. So I think there should be more confidence there. The last kind of note I'll leave on is to say that there is really two different perspectives on this competition in the information space. China believes it is being reactive to US moves. And I think also, the United States does not always understand well, definitely not perfectly, how China interprets US actions in the information space. I think this is quite obvious if we look back in the fall 2020 and that scare. Some of our panelists know that quite well, better than me. But fundamentally, that was about a different perception or a misinterpretation of US actions. And so I think it should be very humbling for us as we approach the competition and the long-term prospects of US-China relations of how much we still don't understand about how China makes those interpretations, and thus should reconsider some of the things we're doing. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Nathan. So as we think about this from competition to conflict, you watch what's happening in Russia. Clearly, lots of interest in the PLA. So Tom, talk to us a little bit about what's happening with the PLA.
Sir, I think it's fair, as we talk about this and about the great game, that we don't just parachute into today in the mill mod of the PLA without understanding how we got here. So just to preface that what we're experiencing today should not be a surprise to us. So starting in 1963, Zhou Enlai identified the 4 modernizations that was reiterated in 77 by Deng. So the PRC had to modernize agriculture, industry, technology, and national defense. So the CCP told us 45 years ago that the PLA would be modernized. And if we look at the context of the bilateral military relationship, certainly within the span of my career, prior to Tiananmen, the relationship was unbelievable in today's context. We were transferring LM-2500 gas turbine engines, programmed to transfer Mark 46 lightweight torpedoes, Q-36, Q-37 counter battery radars, S-70 Blackhawks. There's a Peace Pearl program to refit the avionics of the J-8, 50 J-8s, and other issues which are really incredible in the context of today. Of course, Tiananmen brought that to a rapid conclusion, and with Gulf War I, the PLA faced a scare of precision versus mass, where it needed to get modernized quickly. The Taiwan Strait, or the so-called Taiwan Strait crisis of 95-96, brought an added emphasis for PLA modernization. So the PLA of today, starting in about December of 2015 under Xi Jinping, has undergone its most rapid transformation in its history, reforming from military regions to theater commands, a new emphasis on space and cyber, indeed, the PLA, who the PLA would argue is the Secretary's counterpart. General Li Shangfu brings an impeccable space background to his portfolio as the Minister of National Defense. PLA has taken great steps in modernizing its logistics support force. Its removal of the services from the Central Military Commission, its elevation of the chairman responsibility system, its work to get after a more joint PLA, an acceleration of civil integration, expansion of PLA Navy Marine Corps, movement from division-based to combined arms brigade system, establishment of multiple joint operation command centers, and the movement of the People's Armed Police and the China Coast Guard into kind of a more military framework. Fundamentally, however, it's important that we understand that PLA remains leadership of the PLA remains in a committee-based system under the Central Military Commission with only one ultimate decider, and that's Xi Jinping himself. But the PLA is certainly active in the long game. I think that just in the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen a significant change in behavioral patterns. PLA used the August 2022 senior CODEL visit, as well as a March-April transit of Taiwan leadership to create a new normal behavior in the Western Pacific. Exercises in August of last year were far larger than the 95-96 framework, more complex, more coordinated, more joint, more lethal. And the trends continue today. The words of the Deputy Assistant Secretary to the President and Coordinator for Indo-Pacific, Kurt Campbell, approached the August activity as provocative, destabilizing, and unprecedented. But the long game for the PLA, as the armed wing of the CCP, is a reshaping of the norms where Beijing's might makes right, and Beijing's law, not international law, is the standard. That coercive behavior, whether it's water cannons against Philippine resupply vessels at Second Thomas Shoal, or J-16 chaffing an Australian P-8, or close maneuvering of PLA surface surface ships against Chung Hoon in the Taiwan Strait, demonstrate what lies ahead for the U.S. and our allies and partners. So I think that I would argue the CCP is operating in an integrated coercion with support from the PLA to support efforts in the diplomatic, legal, economic areas. Fundamentally, however, for the M piece of this, we have to understand the PLA not just as a kinetic force, but as the kind of enablers of either the three warfares or the cognitive domain warfare currently underway, and how the CCP contributes and uses the PLA to do that. And I think there's multiple efforts of the PLA reinforcing those areas in the information domain, in the diplomatic domain, and we can talk about that. So really, for the long game, we face the PLA as a coercive actor and an enabler of the CCP, not just the kinetic force of the CCP. And I'll close there.
All right, Tom, thanks. To go to Bonnie, so Cold War over about 6 decades against the Soviet Union. They were never the economic power that China is. So talk to us about China's strategy, economics, and how that plays in the international community.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be a part of this very distinguished panel, and also very hard to follow all my colleagues, particularly after Tom Hendershett. I'll cover broadly 3 different topics. One is talk a bit about China's latent economic power, a bit in terms of what China is doing in terms of what I call carrots, or increasing its leverage, and then of course I'll close on talking about China's economic coercion, the different measures China has done to coerce not only the United States, but also perhaps more importantly, our allies and partners. I think it's very important to start with China's latent economic power, because we have to be aware that sometimes China doesn't even have to coerce countries. Countries may be self-deterred because of how powerful China has become economically. China is currently the top trading partner to over 120 countries, with almost all of China's neighbors highly dependent on trade with China. China is currently ranked #1 in terms of China's GDP is currently ranked #1 in terms of purchasing power parity, and #2 2 in terms of nominal GDP. And I would say that this sheer size creates the illusion that there's significant opportunities to trade with China and for countries to benefit from China. I think it's also important to know, and we did this research last year, if you look at the CSIS China Power website, we looked at countries that had the largest GDPs, and we actually graphed them by freedom score, so how authoritarian, how democratic countries were. And we found that China was actually an outlier on its own. There were no countries next to China that were as authoritarian as China. So China is in a league of its own where it doesn't have that many partners or that many friends that have the same political system as itself. In fact, what we found was the country that has the same freedom score and was the next big economy after China was Saudi Arabia. So that means that China is navigating in a space where it has tremendous economic power, and it is by itself in many ways setting the rules of how it can use this economic power in ways that are different from how democracies are acting right now. I would note that also because of the fact that China is not a democracy, it doesn't have as many restraints on doing business with countries as we do. I don't think China has any qualms aside from potentially looking at whether its investments may be a good use of China's political as well as economic power, but it doesn't have issues with respect to reaching out to countries that we have either sanctioned or we have concerns dealing with given their domestic and human rights concerns. In terms of China's sheer power, I would also note that China currently has set a GDP growth target of 5%. That's still quite higher than currently the US GDP growth. But looking forward, China faces a number of significant economic challenges that we can talk about a bit later, but most project that at least looking forward the next couple years to the next couple decades, China will face significant challenges. So when we think about China's latent economic power, we shouldn't think that China is necessarily on a linear trajectory of continued economic growth. Now let me transition very quickly to looking at several different ways that China thinks about using carrots to provide leverage and encourage countries to work with China. China does this not only at the national level, but also at the individual level with respect to targeting or creating opportunities for individual companies. I think at the most basic level, China has made its economy, if we set aside the COVID years, has generally made its economy attractive to foreign businesses. This has been in the form of special economic zones, even preferential tax policy and other policies. Right now, as China is recovering from COVID, we're seeing Li Keqiang going to Europe advocating for please come and invest in China, right? So we are seeing still quite a bit of this. This combined with cheap and skilled labor, as well as a history of lax environmental regulations, has made China a very attractive destination for companies, U.S. as well as foreign companies. And this in turn has created leverage within China to actually use corporate leaders, the business community, to lobby governments to take a softer approach on China, to rein in competition, but also to think about ways in which security concerns with China should be weighed against economic considerations. On the bilateral, multilateral front, we've talked about some of the measures that China has taken, including Belt and Road, a global development initiative. We also should note that in terms of allies, in terms of expanding a coalition, one area that I am increasingly wary of is what's happening as China expands its coalition, particularly with developing countries, the BRICS countries, particularly with the BRICS Plus. I think we should look at what's happening there as potentially China trying to create its own G7, but with the most leading developing countries. On the sticks and coercion side, I will just focus on briefly because I know I'm running out of time, but I would note that China's economic coercion is very diverse and across the board. It is against individual companies, it is against particular products, it is against countries. And I'll just list a couple of examples of types of actions China has taken to coerce us as well as our allies and partners. So we've seen harassing of business leaders in China. That includes raids on companies. It could also not be even that clear that China is purposely targeting the company, but just periodic inspections. We've seen destruction of products that China views as not adhering to its view of its own sovereignty. That includes products that have labels regarding the China-India border, products regarding how South China Sea is labeled, products regarding how Taiwan Strait or how Taiwan is viewed and Taiwan's status. We've seen China target countries in terms of exports, but those could be in the name of food safety. It could be in the name of public health safety. It could be in the name of various different criteria for China to impose that. More recently, before Secretary Yellen's trip, we've seen China retaliate with respect to what's happening on the semiconductor front with targeting of critical minerals key to that industry. We've seen China impose restrictions on tourism, impose restrictions on Chinese students studying abroad, two of which are actually quite important to the economies of some of China's neighbors. For example, a lot of Southeast Asian countries depend very much on tourism. Chinese students studying abroad are a huge source of income, for example, to Australia. And I would also note that there are also minor things that China does to increase coercion, which include, for example, restrictions in entertainment, as well as popular boycotts that may be due to nationalism. But overall, however, as I look at how China uses its economic power, I would say that a portion of it is the economic coercion, which is not exactly the best and most flexible tool because it actually imposes costs on China domestically too. But I would also say actually a larger portion is the draw and the fear that China imposes, so that China doesn't actually always have to threaten economic coercion, and many countries have to take China into consideration even without the explicit threat. I'll wrap up here. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. So let me ask a couple questions. I'm going to start with Gary with a question about where we are diplomatically. So we've had Secretary Blinken go to China. We've had Secretary of Treasury Yellen go. All at the same time, we're seeing the discussion about de-risking. We've had semiconductor key minerals now that the Chinese are talking about. We're going to preclude those from being put on the market, or we're going to control those. We're controlling different commodities that deal with high-end technologies that get into the security realm. Where does this take us in the relationship, which, months ago we said we probably had hit rock bottom. Now we've got high-level exchanges, I think the first time in 5 years where the Secretary of State's gone into the mainland. So kind of this quid pro quo of sanctioning, yet talking. Where is this taking us? What are the opportunities?
Thank you, General. So the Secretary Blinken's trip had three objectives. First, he wanted to establish empowered senior lines of communication in order to manage our competition responsibly. Second, he wanted to explain the points of disagreement that we have with the PRC so that there are no misperceptions in their system about what it is that we're doing and why it is that we're doing it. And then lastly, he did want to explore potential for cooperation in areas where our interests overlap. But it's important to emphasize that we're clear-eyed about the PRC. We understand that efforts to shape or reform the PRC over the past several decades have failed. And we expect the PRC to be around and to be a major player on the world stage for the rest of our lifetimes. We know that as our competition continues, that the PRC is going to take provocative steps and that we're going to have to push back against those. But it's our firm belief that intense competition requires intense diplomacy if we're going to manage these tensions. This is the only way that we can manage misperceptions. It's the only way that we can signal, communicate, work together where our interests align. And it's important because this is what the world expects of us as a responsible power. I want to emphasize that this is not a strategic shift, and it's also not something that's new to American statecraft. We have decades of experience in dealing with competitors diplomatically and engaging them. We are not going to take a step back from our interests or our values. As for the PRC's response, we've been very clear that we are de-risking and we're not decoupling. The restrictions that we put on technology are based on straightforward national security concerns. These are components that create and develop and field advanced military systems. So as National Security Advisor Sullivan has said, we're taking a small yard, high fence approach to protecting our critical technologies. The aim of this is to protect our national security. It's not to harm the PRC economy. We've been very clear about this in our diplomatic interactions.
So thanks, Gary. So I got a question for Tom on how good is the PLA, and then I'm going to feed that into something where I'd ask Bonnie to start with regards to the economic engine slowdown. So if you go back and you listen to a lot of the articles that have been, or you read a lot of the articles that have been written, a lot of the discussions, you always hear the point of, well, hey, China's not fought a war since 1979. And then we look at our assessments of how good were the Russians as we thought going in February of last year and how that played out. So as the Indo-PACOM J2, as you look at the PLA, How good are they?
Yes, sir. Great question. I think in the context, I'd frame your question that the PLA certainly hasn't been in a significant kinetic conflict since 1979. And while the U.S. Joint Forces had significant lessons learned over the last 20 years, I would argue that we haven't been in the type of conflict we're talking about either. The last time the U.S. fought in a all-domain contested fight, I would argue, is well earlier than 1979 as well. As we look at PLA combat capability, they are certainly watching the world. Much of their mill-to-mill engagement over the last 20 years was driven by being able to take lessons learned from outside of China and spiral them into the PLA. They're eagerly watching Ukraine. So I think while untested, the PLA is certainly not 10 feet tall, but it is not the paper dragon that some would perceive as well. And as we watch the PLA on a daily basis, it's quite remarkable at what skill sets they are after and skill sets they're building on a daily basis. And frankly, the advancements just in the last several years are rather breathtaking.
Can you talk just a little bit about, is there a level of asymmetry in terms of how you see they think about they would want to fight us?
I think sort of one of the big pieces is how our two forces see this, see the strengths of our force. I think we in the Joint Force look at our ability to execute mission command and how our force, frankly, not just our joint force, but our combined force is quite comfortable with mission command and the ability of extremely small units to execute the commander's intent to get to the objective. And I think as we watch the PLA, particularly over the last 20 years, without the development of a professional NCO corps, in some cases, we fooled ourselves that without that professional NCO corps, they couldn't ever get to a mission command-like structure. I would personally, this is my opinion, I would argue that the Chinese society is not particularly set for a mission command and an empowerment of an NCO, but where the PLA is looking to AI, ML, and technology, they are looking at technological solutions to offset a mission command.
So there's a lot that's been in the public domain about, okay, when would they be ready to take on China, or excuse me, to take on Taiwan, and what's the level of risk? We've had, General Minahan made the comments about 2027 in the context of, or 2025, then there's been the discussions of 2027 where she said, I want you to be ready by then. Underpinning that is questions about, has China peaked economically? If you look at one of the covers of The Economist, there's a lot being written now that has China peaked economically. There's a lot of things Xi has done to centralize that engine, which following the financial crisis of 2008, they were responsible for probably 30 or 40% of the global GDP, double digits for a number of years. And now Xi is putting his arms around that. It's slowing down. So for Bonnie, as you see this, what's the impact on China's behavior, their ability to act globally, and does this change their calculus for risk, especially as it relates to Taiwan? And ask Bonnie to comment and then open the rest of the panel.
Sure. General, I think that's a really excellent question that is very complex and difficult to unpack. And I kind of have to say we really need to balance a lot of different factors, which I don't know where they're all going. Because one thing that's becoming clear, particularly as we were talking about the de-risking, decoupling narrative, is that China doesn't really differentiate yet. Don't really buy our arguments that de-risking is not the same as decoupling. And what I worry is if that narrative continues to grow, if China encounters more economic problems at home, it will be blamed on the United States. It will be blamed on us and our allies and partners. So on one hand, we could see that as China's economy slows or as China encounters more difficulty at home, we could see Xi Jinping ramping up nationalism, blaming that on the United States, which could stir up more feelings to take various types of actions, including against Taiwan. But on On the other hand, we also have to look at the economic realities and what, at the end of the day, the CCP Xi Jinping cares about, which is to maintain his power, right? So if you are dealing with a country that has about already 20% unemployment rate for students, I don't think those college students, Tom can comment on this, I don't think those college students are interested in joining the PLA to fight for Taiwan, right? So if China is thinking about a significant use of force, how are they dealing with the situation at home? Can they still provide the jobs for the folks who are not interested in joining the PLA, who are not interested in the hardship, who did not go through the Cultural Revolution, who grew up in a society that was moderately prosperous and could consume all types of good, travel abroad, go vacation in Thailand, go vacation in Japan. Like, that's a very different population that grew up mainly as only children that are not going to be interested in a fight over Taiwan. So I think what we need to see is how some of these conflicting factors actually balance out. So I am not of the type that believes that if China's economy if China's economic growth isn't high, and if we do believe that China is peaking, which I think we have to ask, what does peaking mean? But even if those situations all align together, it's not clear necessarily that China would be much more aggressive. China could also turn inward. So we really have to see how things play out.
So let me talk about technology, and this is pretty broad unless anybody else has any comments on the peak portion of that. And I'll go to Nathan first. Lots has been written about competition, artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum. One report that lays out 40-some categories, of which the preponderance of China is ahead in those, but I think it matters to understand the context. As you read an article that says China has the fastest computer in the world, the real underpinning of that is what problems are they solving? So you gotta have to understand the context when you start seeing some of these metrics thrown out. So Nathan, for your work on psychological warfare, as you look at some of the technology that can be leveraged, how are they looking to leverage things like large language models and generative AI capabilities?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a great example of how technology offers an opportunity for improvement from a Chinese point of view, but also we should be, very aware of the kind of structural limitations they're placing on themselves, right? So fundamentally, generative AI, something like ChatGPT or GPT-4 that we all have played around with a little bit, could offer, in our view, a revolutionary improvement on China's approach to the information domain, right? So a lot of their current existing shortcomings, like lack of high-quality foreign language talent, lack of in-depth understanding of foreign cultures and ability to bridge narratively talking to global audiences. Those are things that generative AI with a high-quality language model that you've trained a little bit can maybe not perfectly solve, but really help you improve to 90% level at scale, right? So that's really something that could be changed, revolutionized by generative AI. And although currently some of the leading places that we all use and know, like OpenAI, are yes, they're American firms, this technology is global, and I think the last count I saw was that China has 80 different models domestically already, so they are indeed pursuing this technology as well. This is also, something that the PLA is aware of. There were multiple articles in PLA Daily, which is their newspaper, hailing generative AI as a potential opportunity for cognitive domain operations. They're not shy about this, even if they don't say it in English. They're not shy when they're talking amongst themselves. But I think there is also limitations that are likely to, in a sense, self-impose, right? So a lot of China's global propaganda, even the covert influence operations, are inherently tied to, constrained by the domestic propaganda lines, right? It's very hard for them to have a heretical global narrative that could potentially come back inside the Great Firewall. They're very cautious of what they're saying. If you look at for example, Hong Kong 2019 covert operations on Facebook and Twitter, right? Really, that was kind of domestic propaganda translated in English, very poorly done, right? Now, I would assume they've improved over time, but still, that's one of the challenges. And so the question then is, if you have a generative model that you really can't control, don't quite understand exactly what it's going to say, how do you use that, right? And what we've seen is the Chinese government very attuned to this risk, right? They're one of the first countries to put out draft regulations that are already rolling out some of these restrictions because they know the power of what this could cause, not just the embarrassment, but really actually driving a lot of issues for them. And so I think one of the questions I have currently unanswerable is, even if they develop a really good model, would they actually trust it to, in a sense, go to work for them, right? Or are they going to spend so much time constraining, limiting, censoring the output that really it doesn't fully achieve its potential? I think that's a question to look for in the future.
Yeah, Nathan. Tom?
Yeah, I think, as we look at something like Made in China 2025 and the technologies that are championed by the central government, I am deeply concerned about the applicability of many of those technologies to the warfighting domain. But I think in some cases what concerns me more is the investment in talent and building technological talent within the PRC. There's a narrative that I grew up with in kind of the China watching community of an inability to innovate. And I can tell you, certainly in the military domain, that the systems that the PLA and the nation are developing for warfighting are certainly extremely innovative. I think that crosses the entirety of the spectrum. That narrative is certainly, if it ever was accurate, and I question that it was, I would say it is not today. And the amount of engineers that China is producing every year, while unemployment remains a significant challenge for college graduates, it's awe-inspiring about how many people the CCP is getting into the technological sphere.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to kind of blend some of the questions I'm getting from the audience. We were talking before we came out about the bench we had on Russia and the lack of a bench that we have in expertise on China. So as you look at everything across the dime, other categories in that, well, what are we getting wrong about our understanding of China, their strategy, the cultural piece, how we interface with them across the national instruments of power? And I'll just kind of open that up for anybody. What are we missing? Are we missing opportunities? And what do we fundamentally misunderstand that we talk past one another? Or we fail to understand what their real interest and intent are? And you have 60 seconds.
I think I'll start us. I think that we are seeing, I think one of the other panelists made a comment alluding to it. I think, Bonnie, you did, that the CCP is giving us opportunities around the world. That, this is not, they are not advancing unimpeded or unchallenged, but much of that challenge is self-imposed. We have to understand where they are. You used the Go reference, where they are moving. I think all of the global initiatives give us a good roadmap for where the CCP is and where they're moving. In my domain and my concern, I'm particularly interested in GSI, Global Security Initiative, and what the CCP is after. But trying to understand for the system to understand what the Chinese are telling us in the clear still remains challenging when we are sometimes overly bore-sighted on a tactical issue, but the Chinese are giving us the strategic map that they're after. Yeah.
So let me start with this. I'm sorry, Bonnie.
Oh, did you want us to just all answer that question?
Yeah, whatever, yeah, please.
I guess for me, I think it's more and more difficult to study China. The information is being much more restricted. A lot of the even general scholarly databases are no longer available. Trade data is no longer available. With the centralization of power, particularly within Xi Jinping, sometimes I worry, when we're looking at the most major decisions, do we actually have to think about all these other interests, or do we really have to get into Xi Jinping's head? Right? Like, if that is what we need to do, and China's providing less information, censoring, and even on the track 2 level, we're getting Chinese scholars who may or may not be allowed to be completely candid with us anymore. How are we going to be able to really understand why China is doing particular actions? And I worry that if we don't have a good sense, our own assumptions about China might frame how we see China.
I think, can I just comment, sir? I think the other piece, Bonnie, is China's becoming, I would argue, a more and more unsafe place for young scholars to go to start work. Following the 2 Michaels, I can't, in good conscience, argue to friends to send their sons and daughters to study in in a place where the State Department again issued warnings about arbitrary detention and the arbitrary applicability of Chinese laws throughout the country. So that's going to certainly affect our China depth, because very, very few of the future specialists will have in-country time.
So I'll pick that up and just very much agree that both doing current research, as somebody does open source research, relying on Chinese language materials, is definitely a challenge now that some of those resources are intentionally being cut off from global access. I think of somebody trying to follow in kind of my general footsteps now, 10, 15 years later. It's much more difficult, right? I think the number I heard recently was like 350 American students in China total. I mean, that was almost the kids I saw around the dorm when I was there. I mean, it's really hard to fathom. And so I think for the immediate moment, perhaps we can survive in a sense based on the existing talent pool, but in terms of the long game, right? Not just 10 years, but definitely 20, 30 years down the road, you have to be able to understand the other guy. And I think that really is going to be a challenge. But just as, Bonnie, we were mentioning that the US is having problems understanding what China is thinking and doing and what its intentions are. I think there are also some structural challenges in Beijing and in China that are going to be problematic too, right? Now, they might have some, they have their own censorship, their own limited resources. Some in the Chinese system can obviously get on Twitter and other places. But the other part of it is that as long as Xi Jinping's around and that centralization, the personalization of power, who's going to be able to tell Xi Jinping, boss, sir, maybe not a great idea, right? And I think fundamentally that is really bad, right? We all know there are challenges in any system, telling your boss or speaking truth to power, but especially within an authoritarian, personalistic regime, I can only imagine, as somebody who hasn't experienced that personally, I can imagine it's hard. And so I think the real risk, as Bonnie was saying, is it feels like sometimes to do China analysis, we're really just doing a psychological profile of Xi Jinping, which I don't believe is the full answer, but gosh, sometimes it feels like that's really a lot of the answer to the question these days. And it's just not, it can't be a good thing for China's understanding as well.
Yeah, one question I'm going to go to a closeout, because I've got a question that says, where does China fit in this, or excuse me, where does India fit in this framework? Which is a great question. When you look at, if you go back several years ago, I think probably late 90s, early turn of the century, the Chinese said, we have no interest at all putting a military base anywhere outside the mainland. Okay, well, we've got DJ. There's a number of places that they're interested. They're getting ports economically. They're locking some of those down. That gives them privileged rights to bring in the military. We're going to see this expand east, west coast of Africa, other places as well. Now they're heavily involved in the Middle East. Clearly, they're heavily involved in Africa. The kind of this Westphalian construct of absolute sovereignty, don't mess with anything inside my borders, kind of that tenet of where they put their strategy. And let me just start with Gary. What should we be taking away from, because it's a maturing where they kind of flex their muscles now. They get involved in the Middle East, they get involved in Africa, and now it's coming to the fore that there's a different kind of competition in what was traditionally our backyard in relationships in the Middle East.
Well, thanks, General. I actually want to seize on something that you said in the question, which is the focus in the PRC on traditional Westphalian groups' ideas of sovereignty. I actually think that this is a strength of the United States and the strength of the international system and our vision for it relative to the PRCs. The PRC talks a good game about sovereignty, but in practice, its policies end up eroding the sovereign decision-making space for the states that they interact with. That's fundamentally what the challenge is. That's fundamentally to us what is the troubling aspect of their vision for the world order. It's very much the fact that it de-emphasizes individual rights, it de-emphasizes political rights, but it also de-emphasizes the space for sovereign decision-making. And I think if you look at the nature of the interactions that the PRC has with smaller states around the world, you see them throw their weight around in ways that ultimately end up limiting their sovereign decision-making space. And so, the coalition that we're building to push back against this vision includes countries from every continent, every part of the world. And I think that we're making the case more and more regularly, and I'm very confident that in the long term, our vision for the world will be more appealing and will win out in the end.
Okay, so this is my speed round question, which I gave them in advance because I got to get off the stage here, is I'll go from Tom, go to the left. What's the takeaway that China has from what's taking place in Ukraine? Tom.
I think how quickly the entire world can mobilize.
Okay, Bonnie.
That China needs to make sure that it's not in the same position as Russia if it were to move on Taiwan.
Nathan.
The importance of narrative competition and information.
And Gary.
The strength of the U.S. alliance structure and the fact that this is not just an alliance that's based on shared values, but also that we're willing to apply hard resources toward.
All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, sir. We thank you especially, sir, for leading this really fascinating discussion this morning. The subject matter experts on your panel clearly were the right ones.
Awesome.
And I feel a lot safer just knowing you guys are doing what you're doing, so thank you very much. We've got an action-packed rest of the morning and afternoon here. We're going to go into a quick break now because we go into our breakout sessions at 10:30. There's 2 fascinating breakout sessions. We'll come back on the floor at 11:30 for a networking lunch, and then back for 2 more breakout sessions at 12:30. And then we ask you to please be back in here for our final plenary at 2 o'clock. So enjoy your day. Thank you very much.